These brains are hidden by all sorts of other damage. They get hit over the head as kids and all that. But there was a pattern there, and so that's when I really got interested in this.
So tell us a little bit about that pattern. What do people notice?
Well, first of all, just in terms of what a psychopath is a personality disorder. And personality disorders are those things in psychiatry that you can't reverse, unfortunately. It's not like a lot of other disorders that we look at. But the basic thing is that they're intraspecies predators. They're predators on other humans, and they have some what are called positive traits. It's called fearless dominance. It looks like charisma. We walk in the room with them, and that's why they're so attractive and dangerous.
A lot of energy.
A tremendous amount of energy. And also there's another group of traits that is called impulsive antisociality, which is the nasty part nobody likes. And that's the one that's most correlated with criminal behavior, very aggressive. But most psychopaths are all around, or they have psychopathic traits. They may not be categorical, clinical ones, but they'll have the traits.
I can't believe how different it is, and you don't need to be a neuroscientist to see the significant difference there. It's almost like half the brain's missing in terms of activity.
In the limbic system, it's absolutely turned off, and this person was shown pictures of awful things and no response to it, so I see it.
And you have this data, and the brain looks like that of a psychopath, which we just talked about with these individuals. It's a personality disorder. You can't necessarily rehabilitate that. Do you ever get to a point where you do that, and as a society you say, you know, we can't afford for you to be out there because you will act on these impulses?
It's a mistake we keep making. And you know, after these studies, I became much more against the death penalty because they actually don't think what they're doing is really wrong. They know you think it's wrong.
Right.
Because to them it's not.
It's not immoral. So it's like, so that's a weird chunk of it. But the other thing is they always keep doing the same thing. As a society, we have a romantic notion that everybody is a good boy and good girl inside, and they're not. And the pattern is, if you look at the animation, which is this rotating brain, which are always fun, you can see that most of what you see is on the outside, the cortex. Well, the areas of the brain that are involved in psychopathy are not in the outside. You can't see them. They're in the midline, or in the inside. And it's part of what's called the limbic system, or the emotional brain. Part of that emotional brain, you've heard of the amygdala, I'm sure, which is at the tip of the temporal lobe. It's processing positive, negative emotions, aggression, predatory behavior, sex, rock and roll, you name it, addiction. But the other part, so that's kind of the id, and then the other part is called the orbital cortex, right above the eyes, because that's the orbits, and that's the part that's really associated with moral behavior, moral reasoning. Well, it turns out that in everybody's brain, these are in balance. The normal thing, because there's a time to kill, there's a time for sex. Psychopaths don't have that context. And those two areas are turned off in these people.
So that's like the superego. There's no shame there, right?
Yeah, the orbital cortex, like the superego, it's your conscience.
You would expect to see the areas responsible for morality and empathy light up. And those areas are going to be here. So if I turn this around, so if you look, you're going to see like this line here. This is dividing what I'm going to surround here. This is called the anterior cingulate cortex. And then this region here is called the ventromedial prefrontal cortex. Now, both of these areas are strongly linked to morality and empathy. And so when you put them through these types of moral and ethical dilemmas, what you see is that they're just completely underactive, to the point where you can make the argument that they don't feel empathy. Or if they do, it's at such an extraordinarily small level that we don't know how to properly understand it. And that also means that their moral compass is completely skewed, which is just terrifying and fascinating. Now, this region of the brain right here is called the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. And this is the last region of the brain to develop in the human being. So some of you may have heard that the brain doesn't fully mature until you're 25 years old. Well, specifically, we're talking about the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, or the DLPFC. Now, the DLPFC is responsible for rational decision making. You can think of it as your risk assessment center. It's the lens with which you view the world, right? You make rational decisions based on the connections made in this area. And the reason why it's delayed in its maturation is because it takes the human being around 25 years, and again, there's wiggle room with this, to make mistakes, to learn from role models, teachers, parents, television shows, you name it, about the differences between right or wrong, or what's a smart or an intelligent versus an unintelligent decision. And it's able to do this from feedback from other areas. So the anterior cingulate, posterior cingulate, the that's like the DLPFC is going to come from the ventral medial PFC, or the orbitofrontal cortex. All these different regions of the brain, if I can hold it properly for you to see, are going to be giving feedback to that DLPFC saying, hey, this is how we respond to these moral and ethical issues. Well, if you recall, when the brain is developing in utero and serotonin is responsible for that, well, with psychopaths, that's reduced. And so what we find is that if these areas that go to the DLPFC, that relay information, aren't active, that is going to change how synapses are formed in this region. Meaning, to a psychopath, their behavior is not irrational. It's completely rational because their rational center has formed around the irrational. This is why they don't feel bad. This is why they're not bothered by that scenario with the child losing their parents. They're not bothered when they do something that the rest of us are like, you can't do that. They steal something or hurt someone or just behave in this way that the rest of us would feel morally and ethically compromised. They don't feel that because their brain is literally processing the information differently than it would for you or I. In order for it to crumble, you then need environmental conditions to amplify it, to really cause that devastation. And this occurs through childhood traumatic experience. Again, so this could be like, abusive parents. This could be sexual abuse, right? Not just emotional, but sexual abuse. Can bring sociopathy back into the equation because we all know that trauma at any age can be devastating, but childhood trauma is especially devastating because, again, going back, all those different areas of the prefrontal cortex are, sending information to the DLPFC. Well, even if you don't have that MAOAL gene, right? Even if you don't have the altered brain structures, but you're young enough and you still grow up or experience that childhood trauma, that can be enough to shift that DLPFC, to cause aberrations in those other areas to where they become low functioning. So you get essentially the same type of result as you did with psychopathy, but this time it's almost purely based on environment. Considering that both psychopaths and sociopaths belong to antisocial personality disorder, it makes perfect sense that they're going to share several behaviors. And one of those is going to be a complete lack of empathy. It's physically impossible in most cases for them to put themselves in another's shoes, right? To see it through their eyes and feel the way that they are feeling. But then they also have little to no anxiety because then they could steal something or hurt someone and not feel bad about it, even though there's a high risk to it. But the thing is, when they take those risks, they're still going to get adrenaline. They're still going to get dopamine hits. So it's going to help to make them feel alive, which then just starts to kind of like get the ball rolling to create this out of control behavior, especially when we're talking about sociopaths. But they're also going to have and share an enjoyment of having power over others. And again, that makes perfect sense, especially when you couple it with a lack of anxiety as well as the lack of empathy, right? Because then it's going to be easier for them to become successful in a lot of ways, especially when it comes to psychopaths. And we'll talk about that shortly. But the other, and in my eyes, probably the most disturbing thing about it that they share is a lack of remorse, right? They don't feel guilt or shame. So it's not just that they couldn't empathize and they weren't anxious and they enjoyed the power. Once they know the end result of what they've done, they don't feel bad about it, right? They're not like sitting there losing sleep. They don't really think about it. Someone could be crying in front of them, an emotional wreck about what they have done to them. And it's just like, well, that's just part of playing the game. Psychopaths tend to gravitate towards positions of power, right? So sometimes they can become psychopathic serial killers, but a lot of other times they may become a lawyer, they may become just a doctor, and they may not be an angel of death, but they enjoy that position of power and manipulation and everything they can do with it. But you're also going to see them become military members. You're going to see them become police officers. And they can make outstanding businessmen or businesswomen, right? CEOs, right? That's what makes psychopaths so different from sociopaths, is the fact that to me, it comes down to their ability to plan and not be reactionary. And that's the thing with sociopaths. They are far more abrasive than psychopaths are going to be, right? They're far more reactionary. They don't like to, or really think even, to fly under the radar. Instead, they're just going to do things to do them, right? These are the type of people that don't mind showing that they're cruel, that don't mind showing that they're manipulating. They just don't care, right? So you can think of almost like this may be a terrible analogy, and it's like, I don't mean to, but I'm just going to say it. I tend to think of sociopaths almost like a rabid dog. And then I tend to think of psychopaths as being more of a trained dog that's a trained attack dog, right? Both are capable of just obscene destruction, but the method they go about it is going to be completely different. And that, to me, is what makes them so scary, but in just their own unique ways. So is there anything that can be done to treat these individuals? The sad and unfortunate answer is likely no, at least given current technology and the current state of medicine. I mean, the fact is you're dealing with a hardware problem, right? You're dealing with literal changes in the genetic sequencing and the physical brain itself, even with sociopathy, right? Because emotional trauma will literally change the areas of the brain, the way the synapses communicate with each other, the pattern with which they communicate with each other. So what we're talking about here is brain plasticity issues combined with genetic deficiencies. And again, MAOA isn't the only gene that we found that correlates with psychopathy and antisocial personality disorder. There are other genes. So then it's like, we have to figure out which of those genes is being read in which order. How do they relate? I mean, it's not as simple. I wish it was as simple, especially with, like, and I mentioned this earlier, genetic engineering, like CRISPR type technologies, that we could just go in there and change the genes and boom, you fixed it. But again, you then have the emotional trauma aspect. Even if we do get to that point where we can do genetic engineering and actually fix that underlying issue, we still have the emotional trauma aspect. Bad things happen, you know? But to me, it's like, if there's anything that we could do as a society, and even like cross-culturally, across the world, and this is a tall order, I know what I'm about to say, trust me, I know what I'm about to say, it's be better parents. It's be better role models. And it's like every day is a lesson. If you've never dealt with a tantruming 3-year-old, all right, they are some of the rudest people alive. They are just obscenely insane. In fact, I actually should mention this. When you're diagnosing antisocial personality disorder, they can't even diagnose it under the age of 18. And some psychologists and psychiatrists want to push that out even farther. And that's because children and teenagers actually display many antisocial traits, right? Kids are ridiculous. They do all sorts of stuff. They test boundaries, push boundaries, they drive you nuts in a lot of ways, right? They're the most beautiful people that's ever walked the earth, but they are crazy people too. And where, hey, we're gonna do better. But unfortunately, I think that's what needs to happen, or at least make significant strides. Because again, even if you treat the underlying genetic susceptibilities, you still have the emotional aspect.
Because in that case, it's a matter of our very existence. But they cannot be unaware that it's impossible to conquer Russia on the battlefield. That's why they carry on with their information attacks. They choose young generation, first of all, and they carry on lying, distorting historical facts. They never cease with attacks on our culture, our Orthodox Church, other religious organizations. Look at what they're doing with their own people, destroying families, cultures, national identities. Perversions, up to pedophilia, are declared to be a norm of their lives. priests are forced to bless single-sex marriages, same-sex marriages. What can I say? People have the right to live the way they want. Nobody intrudes upon private life. Nobody wants to do that. But I want to say to them, look, here is Holy Scripture and other scriptures of world religions. They say everything, including that the family is a union of man and wife. But even those sacred texts are put under doubt. As it's well known, the Anglican Church is planning to consider the idea of a gender-neutral God. What can I say? They don't know what they're doing. Millions of people in the West understand that they are brought to true spiritual disaster. The elites are just going mad, and this is incurable apparently, but it's their problem. While we are bound to defend our children, and they will do that, will defend our children from degradation. It's obvious that the West will try to break apart our society, to stake on those who have the same poison of contempt to their homeland and the wish to gain from selling that poison to those who willing to pay for that. Somebody became real traitors, committing crimes directed against the security of our country. Those people will be punished by law, but we will never be similar to the Kiev regime and Western elites.
And at this point, we will say goodbye